with our reading plan. Like I said, if you haven't picked one up, you can pick up one that looks like this on the back resource table. You can download it, F260 Bible reading plan, the chronological one, or something else I printed out some of that I forgot I had. If you'd like something that's a little bit more detailed, what's this one the staple fell out of, that has kind of like a journaling thing you can do each month, and it gives you each week's readings and days. And it also has some information at the beginning about how to have quiet times and just some different things about studying the Bible. I've got several of these up here. Don't take that one, the staples out of it. But I've got several of these up here if you'd like to pick one of those up. Okay, so last week we were in Genesis primarily. That's where the readings kind of started, was in Genesis. And since we're doing a chronological plan, it's following the chronology of the best guess, best estimation of when things happened, not necessarily when they were written. So this is not chronological based on when it was written. It's chronological based on when it's happened. So for that reason, the majority of our readings between last Wednesday and this Wednesday are actually from the book of Job. Actually, where I told you sometimes we're going to skip chapters, this is one of those instances where the author of this Bible reading plan, he actually skips the majority of Job. He only handles the first 2 chapters and the last 6 chapters. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. We're going to look at the whole book in one session. So looking at Job, starting in chapter 1, it's important as we start to remember that some things about Job. So let me pull this up. There we go. The reason why it's set right here in this chronological reading plan. So you'll notice the last thing you would have read in Genesis is Genesis chapter 6, the flood. And they're restarting. And then Job, and then also the Bible reading plan authors jump to Job. Well, the book of Job doesn't exactly tell us when it is, but there's certain things that we read in the book of Job that tell us about the time period. And so best guesses are Job is written during the patriarchal time. So we're talking Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, during that time period. And one of the main reasons we know that is because in the very first chapter, it says that Job would go in verse 5, and when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. Job was acting as a priest for his family. Now, before the temple comes in, there's no priesthood. And so it was common that the patriarch of the family, that's why it's called the patriarchal time period, the patriarch of the family also acted as the priest of the family. And so here's Job making offerings and sacrifices for his kids. And so we have this setting here. This is early. Plus, Job's also cool because like in the King James Version, it's the only time you can find the word unicorn in the Bible. The word unicorn is in the King James Version. It's a Hebrew term that means some form of animal. We don't know what kind of animal, but the early translators used the word unicorn. Behemoth, Leviathan. If you actually go to Genesis or Job 40, I think it's 41 when he does it, he talks about this dragon type character, the Leviathan, that breathed fire. And I mean, it's pretty cool. So I mean, this is early human history. And most people believe, we don't know who actually wrote it. The Jewish tradition since like before Jesus was ever born is that Moses wrote the book of Job. He recorded Job in the same time period he recorded Genesis and Exodus and all that time period. Because there's about 40 years there where Moses didn't have anything to do but write, because he was just in the wilderness wandering around. And so they think that Job was probably the author. And I would probably agree with that. None of the other books, Moses lists himself as the author. So I would probably guess along these lines that this is also the same thing. Yeah, we'll get to Moses. So are we. But the biggest thing about Job is, and the reason why a lot of people connect with the book of Job is, the book of Job teaches us that suffering comes to everyone. Everyone suffers. Suffering comes to everyone, both the righteous and the unrighteous alike. This is why I always joke, but it's true. You will not hear many prosperity gospel preachers preach from the book of Job, because it's not the message that's popular, is that bad things sometimes happen to good people, and God allows it. And that's not a message that's not the image of God people like to have in their mind, that God allows this. And so this is why we want to kind of take it. We're not going to be able to go details in a lot of things, but I do want to look at some things through this. So we first look, we can honestly see, I'm just going to read the first 5 verses so we get a context, and then we'll just be picking verses throughout the book from that. But so there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. There were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. He possessed 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 female donkeys, and very many servants. So this man was the greatest of all the people of the East. His sons used to go and hold a feast in the house of each one on his day, and they would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the days of the feast had run their course, Job would send and consecrate them, and he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did continually. So we can see very clearly, Job's a wealthy man. I mean, I know this is a long time ago, but even today, if a guy had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, servants, he's a rich guy in today's standards. In that standard, I mean, even more so. But he's a very rich guy. The text says that he's blameless, he's upright, he's godly. That doesn't mean he's perfect. It says the same thing about Noah in Genesis 6. Doesn't mean they're perfect, but it means that even when they're wrong, they're willing to admit when they're wrong and they make it right. This is where I think a lot of my definition for blameless comes from, is that though they might be at blame, they're blameless because they take the blame for what's theirs. And so it says, I mean, Job's like the model person, which is interesting because we just finished reading that was the model person at that time period was Noah. And I think that's why the Bible writers or the reading plan writers use it at this point. But Satan comes in the picture. In the rest of chapter 1, Satan comes in, and there's a whole lot of questions here about how, Satan goes into the throne room of heaven. He's talking with God. And a lot of other angels are there. What does all that mean? I don't know. I mean, that's just the truth of it. We don't know. We can make speculations, all this and that. But here's what we can say, and something we need to really understand very quickly. Verse 8. Before I actually go to that part about Satan, I want to look at verse 8. It says on verse 8 that Satan was talking with the Lord, and basically Satan says he's been going to and fro from the Lord. And in verse 8, and the Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" He's basically setting Satan up to go and tempt Job to blame God, to curse God. And God said he won't do it. He's not going to do it. Look, this man's upright. This man is blameless. And I just think about this. I'm like, do you think when Job got to heaven and he got to go into that throne room, do you think once he realized what all had happened and he had a full understanding of all this being allowed to happen, this was all a discussion in the throne room, do you think Job went up there and says, "Really, God, did you have to say, have you considered Job?" Like there wasn't nobody else you could think about to get tested in this moment. Like, did you really have to say me? But he did. And so Satan, first thing, verse 12, it says that, and the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. And then we find out Satan takes all of his possessions, takes all of Job's possessions, takes his family. I mean, he takes everything from him except his health. And literally, the important thing to see here about Satan and God, about this throne room discussion, Satan is still under the control of God. He's not allowed to touch Satan physically or touch Job physically. God says you can do anything else to him, but don't touch him. Satan still has to abide under the authority of God in this situation. And so I think that's important to recognize that even in today's world, the things that are being allowed, God is allowing them to happen, but Satan has a limit. Satan has a limit as to what God will allow. And God puts parameters on what Satan can do and what he cannot do. And so he puts this parameter and says, you can't touch him. Well, then Satan takes everything. Job doesn't curse God. Actually, if you go further, just go ahead and read into it. After Job gets everything taken from him, it says in verse 20, then Job arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshiped. And he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I want you to pay really close attention to the wording of that. It says Job tore his robe, he shaved his head, he fell on the ground, and he worshiped. Job's had everything taken from him. His children, his family, except for his wife. Later on, you're going to see where he probably wishes his wife would have gotten taken. But everybody else gets taken. All of his belongings, all in the same day. I mean, you can imagine the grief. It doesn't compare, but it does compare in some way. I think to like the people that were in Kenton and Sandburg and all the different areas that got hit with tornadoes. Like that one day, everything was great. They had all this stuff. And the next day, they had nothing. It's gone. But it's interesting that the act of tearing his robe, shaving his head, all that was biblical imagery back then for mourning. You always do these things when you mourn. And so he's going into mourning, but then it says he fell down and worshiped. And this is where I think we need to understand that worship is not always just sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes we can get a bad imagery in our mind that worship is only like and honestly, it's our own fault for how we use the word. That sometimes we think, I'll just give you an example. Sunday mornings. I know growing up, and anybody in here that knows what I'm talking about, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about. There's the worship time and the preaching time. And I mean, I always remember everybody always separating it that way. But if we understand the word worship right, the whole hour is worship. Both in this, when we're singing, we're worshiping. When we're studying the word, we're worshiping. When we're praying, we're worshiping. Or at least we should be. And not just that, it's not just about a worship hour. Now, that's a service devoted to worship. But even if we're looking at our lives correctly, going to work should be worship. I got some eyeballs from people right there. It should be, if we're doing it for the right reason. If we're doing it to the glory of God, yeah, sometimes the people we work with, sometimes the people we work for, you want to punch them in the mouth. Or you want to call down Satan on somebody. But if we're doing it to the glory of God and we're saying, I want my work to reflect God's image in me. Just kind of like I talked about in the video last week. We're created to work. It says in Genesis chapter 2 that God didn't create Adam until he looked on the garden and saw it needed someone to work it. And it was God's plan to create Adam. But it may tell us in the text that Adam's reason was to work and keep the garden. And so we're created to work. That's what I know I'm not older. And so sometimes it's a young guy talking to an older guy. But at the same time, I still like to say, even when we retire and we're not doing it anymore, the people who I've watched go down fastest are those who quit working. Just because you quit going to a job doesn't mean you quit working. Those are the people who I've watched go down. I mean, I watched a guy 60 years old, healthy, got early retirement, could have done anything. He sat down in that recliner, and within a year, he was basically, health was terrible, and he was dead because all he did was sit in that recliner and watch TV all day long. That he'd worked his whole life, he was going to sit down now. Sitting down's fine, but don't sit down all the time. We got to work. We're supposed to work. And so Satan here, he attacks Job. He takes everything from Job, but Job worships in his mourning. And this is right. I want you to understand, sometimes worship can be just as great when we're singing those songs that make us feel good. But sometimes worship can be just as great during those moments as they are during tears and despair and grief. I meant to bring it up here and I forgot it, but Charles Spurgeon said about this part of the text that it's through I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but it's in the beauty of these moments that we see, in the same way that it takes years and years of hardship to create pearls. It's in the same way that sometimes in many of us, it takes years and years of hardship to create pearls of worship that we understand. And so this is in the same way Job, he reacts, He worships through his tears. I'm sure he's crying. He's lost all his kids. He reacts. He worships. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb. Naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord, of course, one of the most quoted verses, the Lord gave, the Lord is taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord. Then verse 22 says, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. So Satan's wrong. God said you can take everything from him. He won't, he'll curse you. So Satan took everything from him. He didn't curse God. So then Satan comes back and says, yeah, but that's because he's still got his health. You take his health from him, he'll curse you. He'll curse you. And so God says, okay, you can have him. Do what you want to him. Man, can you imagine? I just think about that. Like, I know Job doesn't know what's happening, but to know God told Satan, like, okay, I know, I have faith in Job. He's not going to curse me. So you can do what you want to him. And so Satan does. He infects him with all these infections. Basically, Job ends up crawling down in a corner with boils and everything else on his body and scraping himself with a piece of pottery. And then in verse 9, chapter 2, verse 9, oh man. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. Like Wife of the Year award. Like, here's this man who's holding out everything, and his wife comes in and is like, curse God and die. Thanks, babe. Wasn't hard enough. And so even his wife is tempting him. It's not just Satan anymore. Even his own wife is pushing him just to forget it all. Forget your integrity. Forget God. And yet, Job can still respond. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Good for you, Job. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Job's been through a lot in a very short period of time. I mean, he's been through a lot. And honestly, he did not sin with his lips. He did not curse God. But if you read the whole book, if you read all the speeches Job gives and all the speeches his friends give, Job's angry. You're going to see that in these speeches. I mean, he's angry. And I think that's when it tells us throughout the rest of the Bible that Job never sinned in this whole ordeal. I think that helps us also understand that God created us with a human emotion, and anger is one of those emotions, and it's going to happen. And sometimes, I mean, maybe I'm the only one who can admit it, but I've been angry at God before, and I have voiced that to God. Now, I've been humbled by God afterwards also, in the same way Job was. But I've been angry at God before. I mean, my dad died at 60 years old. Didn't ever get to see any of my children born. Anything like that. It still makes me angry when I think about it. But yet, I'm not sinning because I'm not cursing God. I'm not blaming God. It's just anger, and it's coming out. But honestly, Job's friends don't help in the matter. And that's when that's one of the little small lessons I want to show you right here about being a friend. We'll just go to verse 11. So now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. They actually made a plan. So they made an appointment. They made a plan to leave their homes, to leave their families, to leave their farms and everything else, to go and spend time with their friend. I think that's important to recognize here. They have genuinely good reasons for going to be there, because they want to be and bring comfort to their friend. They want to sympathize with him and not have him just be alone. I mean, you think what it just followed about his wife. I mean, Job probably don't want to be around his wife right now. So he's probably just alone. All of his kids are gone. And so they go to spend time with him. Verse 13, it says, and they sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. If Job would just end, the book of Job would just end right there. These are the 3 greatest friends in the world. They went and just sat with him 7 days, 7 nights, but they never spoke. They never said anything. They just sat with him. Where the trouble starts is when they start opening their mouths. That's the same with most of us. And so one of the greatest lessons, it's a side lesson in Job, but I want to make sure I bring it up, is remembering that when someone's suffering, when someone's going through something, when someone's going through a trial, sometimes the best thing for us to do is not to talk, but just be there, be present. As a pastor, I've gone on 12 years now preaching, being a pastor. I've been at the bedside of a lot of people who've passed away. Now I also work for a funeral home, and so therefore I pick them up too. And so I'm there at death a lot. And I'll tell you, even when my dad died, I know a lot of people said a lot of things to me at that house when my dad died. And many of you can think back right now when one of your dear friends or dear loved ones or parents or something like that died and you were there. And people came to comfort you. They made an attempt to come and comfort you, and they talked. There ain't probably anything that anybody ever remembers being said. Because the truth is, in that moment, there's really nothing that can be said that's going to help comfort in that moment. But I tell you what I can remember. I can almost take a piece of paper right now and list you out every single person that came to our house that day that my dad died, that were there, that were just present. Presence means something. Just being present when someone's going through a trial, when someone's just going through, even if that means not just death, but just going through anything else, not having to, and this is where we as men sometimes do worse. We see a problem, we want to solve it. And so our instinct is to start solving it and to speaking how we're going to solve it. When the best thing to do might be just be there. They know how to do it. They know how to fix the problem. It's hard. And they just want somebody to be there and to be there to understand. And so don't learn from Job's friends up until this point. Be present. Be present, but be careful with what you say. See, that's where Job and his friends get in trouble after this, from chapter 3 all the way through 37. There's speeches from Job and these three friends. And then Elihu, who comes in at the end, is another person that speaks. The only friend that God doesn't rebuke. But Job and his friends speaking. Job's angry. He's voicing his anger. And so if his friends wanted to help him right now, the best thing they could have done is just let him vent and listen to him instead of trying to respond to him. Because what happens is when they start responding to him, they start making some very grave errors. And so this also I want to tell you is a lot of people pull quotes and Bible verses from the book of Job out a lot to say in certain situations. Be very careful with how you do that. Because if somebody is really interested and they go look it up, 9 times out of 10, the verses that get quoted from Job are verses poorly used in context. And when they go and read like the whole chapter, it comes from something like that, they might learn some things that weren't right and it doesn't fit. So be careful with how you quote Job. But Job's saying all these things, and his friends are coming back, and they're basically his friends that bring 30-something chapters together are basically saying, Job, here's the deal. All this bad stuff happened to you, and it had to have happened for a reason. So you've either sinned or you've done something to anger God. And so they're basically, for 30-something chapters, they're like calling Job to repent of whatever it is he's done. And Job starts getting mad, and he's already angry, and he's like, look, I've not done anything. I don't deserve this. And so that pushes his anger further. And so then he starts charging it towards God. And it's like, I want to take God on trial right now. I don't deserve this. And so that's where the friends did not help Job in the situation. And Job and them go back and forth for 30-something odd chapters, 34 chapters. They go back and forth, back and forth. But listen, I mean, there's a way I can tell you explicitly, I can remember sitting in the car hearing it. There's sometimes we use some phrasing just like this, and we have to be very careful with it. I remember as a child, in 97, I think 97 is when the tornadoes came through Three-Way, and that they hit our house or hit our shop, and it just hit our shop, took our cars out, stuff like that. But there were some other people that got hit in the area that run our church that, I mean, it took out the trailers, flipped them over, stuff like that. And I remember there was this one family, and I mean, they weren't like a regular attending church family. They weren't like bad people either. They were what we would probably call today average. They're just average, semi-religious, semi-not, just kind of that way. And I remember they got hit by the tornado. They got their insurance and all that, got a new mobile home, new trailer, probably within about a month, 2 months. And literally within like a week, that trailer caught fire and burned down completely. They lost everything twice in the same 2 months. And I remember, she was a family member of mine, one of my mom's cousins. She was in the car with us. Of course, I was a child, and we were driving by that home. And I remember hearing this cousin who was a staunch Baptist, like staunch, like she didn't cook anything that wasn't in a 9x13 casserole dish. She was hardcore Baptist. And I remember her sitting in the front seat, me sitting in the back seat. We drove by that house, and I remember her saying these words. Boy, they've had a whole lot happen to them the last couple months. Mom saying, yeah, it's just really bad. She said, they must not be living right. I've heard that. I've heard that in this church from people. You have got to be very, very careful saying that. Because here's the thing. Bad things do happen to good people. Sometimes good people go through trials that they don't deserve. This is a part of life. And when we say something like that, like they must not be living right because these bad things are happening in their life, you are playing the role of God. I tell you one time where I've heard it, not in this church, but I heard it in this more modern context since I've been an adult. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, there was a certain very popular pastor on TV who said Hurricane Katrina was God's judgment on New Orleans. And I remember sitting there thinking that and watching him. And I thought, you don't have the authority to say that. What about all the godly people that lived in New Orleans? Because at that time, I was working with a church plant in New Orleans. And I was thinking about Matt and them. They were in Nashville because they got run out of New Orleans from Katrina. I was thinking about the seminary there. I mean, I wasn't in seminary yet, but I was thinking about all these things that was going on. And he's going to say that line. We have to be very careful when we see someone going through something to say immediately, that's God's judgment on them. We don't have the authority to do that. Is it sometimes? Possibly. But we don't have the authority to determine when and where. That's God's role, which is what brings us to the end of Job. They go through all this through Job, and then they get to chapter 38. One of my favorite lines in the whole Bible. Chapter 38, verse 3. Chapter 38, verse 3. The whole last 4 chapters, or 38, 39, 40, 41, 42, the whole last 4 out of 5 chapters are all pretty much God speaking. And so we're not going to go through line by line everything but God says, but it's God responding to Job. So starting off verse 1 of verse 38, chapter 38, it says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Favorite verse of the Bible. Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you will make it known to me. So the King James Version, so the way this actually translates in Hebrew is gird up your loins. Okay? And I think I've described this once before, but just in case nobody knows. So, of course, back in this time period, everybody wore robes. I've never personally worn a dress. Well, not publicly. No, I'm just kidding. But I've never worn a dress. I don't even have a house coat or a gown or anything like that. But I can imagine, every time you see Roman soldiers and stuff like that, I always look at them like, these are the epitome of like soldiers, but they're wearing mini skirts. Like something doesn't fit well with me with that, but they wear robes. And so many times before a soldier, that robe that you see real short, that's actually a full-length robe. Girding up their loins is when they would take this robe. Because, ladies, you might be the one who have to answer this. I'm pretty sure running full speed in battle and getting in a fight in an ankle-length dress would be pretty difficult. And so girding up your loins was you would take the robe and you would bring it up and tie it around your loins so that you were able to fight. This was called girding up your loins. God comes out of the whirlwind and says, all right, Job, you've been running your mouth for 30 chapters. All right, boy, I'm here. Let's do this. I mean, basically, in modern day terms, God came out of the whirlwind and said, okay, Job, I'm here. Put your cup on, get your helmet. It's time to play with the big boys. And God goes at him. And so for the next 2 chapters, God just rhetorical question. Were you there when I set the foundations of the earth? Oh, that's right, you weren't. Were you there when I did this? Were you there? Do you know how to do this? Do you know how to do that? Do you know how this happens? Do you know how that happens? Do you know how to actually create the rain? I mean, he does these over and over. I mean, it's honestly, by the time you get about 10 verses into it, it starts to get kind of funny. Like God is just bam, bam, bam. Every 2 verses, he's asking a different question. And we learn a lot about the time period. That's where we get the time period from this. So he's just over and over and over, he's hammering Job. Job is getting humbled. Where were you? Were you there? How was this done? Can you do this? Do you know this? Who does what? And so you get to chapter 40 and verse 3. Job finally responds. God stops for a quick second for Job to speak and says, literally in verse 3 of chapter 40, then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. I have spoken once and I will not answer twice, but I will proceed no further. Job basically says, I get it. You've made your point. I don't have the authority to charge you with anything. I wasn't there. I don't know how to do this. I don't know. I don't have the authority like you do. I don't have these things. And he says, so I admit I spoke and I was wrong. I won't do it again. I'm putting my hand over my mouth. I'm not saying anything. You know, there's a part of Job right now. It's kind of like when we get caught and somebody, or I mean, like for instance, not when I say get caught, whenever I tell Leah something and she tells me I'm wrong. Okay. But then something happens and she finds out I'm right. Do y'all think I let that go away very quickly? No. There was a certain person that sent me a text message one time that I still haven't let go of. Not going to name any names since this is on the internet. But the aspect, I mean, that's what God's doing. And you think when that happens, like when Leah knows I'm right, she wants me to be quiet. She cannot stand how I keep rubbing it in. This is probably how Job feels right now, except multiplied times 100. God is just bam, 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 bam. Job is out for the count. Puts his hand over his mouth, says, I'm not saying another word. It's funny. I love this. God says, good. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, that's going back to chapter 4, dress for action again. He says, dress for action like a man. Gird up your loins again. You're not done. I'm going at you again. For the next chapter and a half, 2 chapters, God does the same thing. Rhetorical question after rhetorical question after rhetorical question. Chapter 42, Job answered in completion. He says, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Job gets humbled and remembers. Now, God restores Job. He restores his fortunes, gives him more children. But Job still went through a great loss and went through a great ordeal. And so what's the main lessons we can take out of Job? First thing, bad things do happen to good people. But they have purpose. They can have, I need to rephrase that. They can have purpose. This is something that we have to remember as Christians, is that bad things do happen to good people. We're all in this room going to experience suffering. We're all going to experience issues with health. We're all going to experience loss. We're all going to experience different things that's going to come about through our lives. But we can endure through them because we know and trust that God can bring good out of them. I just saw that this week. Many of y'all know that my dear friend Dale No over in Arkansas was diagnosed with cancer back last year. Dale has been through a lot in the last year. He's been through three surgeries now. Had his last surgery right before Christmas, and he got to come home 2 days before Christmas. They end up thinking they got all the cancer out, but they did have to remove like his spleen and I think part of his liver. They had to do a bunch. It's part of his colon. They had a resection of his colon, all kinds of stuff. He finally got to come home about 3 days before Christmas, and then things weren't right, but he lasted through Christmas. On the Monday after Christmas, he went back. He had major infection. He had a cyst or an abscess. He just had major issues. And I was talking to Dale on the phone because he got to come home this week or last week. And I was talking to him on the phone. And out of all this he's been through, we were sitting there talking. I mean, it's bad. I mean, he's gone through a lot. And he said, you know the greatest thing? I said, what? He said, man, he said, being in the hospital, when I had to go back in, I was having the same nurses every day. And it was a really nice hospital and really nice nurses. But I got to talk to the same people every day. And he said, I got to share the gospel with several people. He said, I didn't have anybody believe or commit anything to the gospel. He said, but I did have one nurse who was going back to practitioner school, and she had basically fallen out of church. And he said, just through her conversations with me the day I was getting discharged, she told me that she went back to church that Sunday and she was getting plugged back into church. And he spent most of his time talking about her than he did his own sickness. And I thought, here's a situation that was terrible, bad, nearly died twice. And here's a girl who fallen out of church. Maybe she's a Christian, maybe not. Maybe she's going to become a Christian. Maybe the reason she's going to become a Christian is because she's going back to church now, and all because Dale Noe was in that hospital room and she saw him every day. That's how God brings good out of bad situations. And he does that in many different ways a lot. Second main lesson I want us to remember is that the biggest lesson we learn from Job is what Job had to learn. We are not God. We don't get the authority to say when something is judgment and when it is not. Our purpose as creation is to abide by the Lord, not to be the Lord. And so we need to recognize. And so in Isaiah 55:8, a great example is, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. We can't understand why God, I can't understand why God allowed my dad to get lung cancer and die at 60 years old. I can't understand why Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. I can't understand why the tornadoes came through here recently. I can't understand why those things are allowed. I can't understand why a young man can walk into a school and start shooting people. I can't understand how those things, why they're allowed, why they happen. But what I can do is I can trust that God is in control. God is in control. He's allowed things to happen. He's created men with free will to make decisions. And he allows Satan a certain limit, but there's a limit. There is a limit to what he'll allow. And so one of the biggest lessons learned from Job is what Job had to learn is we're not God. And we don't need to act like we are. And so with that, as Christians, we can endure grief, we can endure suffering, we can endure trials because of Christmas, because of Emmanuel, because God is with us. It's the beauty of the gospel is that on Christmas morning, Jesus came, and of course his name Emmanuel, God is with us. But as Jesus goes to the cross and as he's resurrected, the disciples actually got to physically have Jesus with them. But do you know that what we have today is greater than what the disciples had walking with Jesus day by day? It's what the Old Testament saints dreamed for. We don't just have God with us. We have God in us. Because in the resurrection, the Holy Spirit coming on believers, we're indwelt by God. So there's never a moment God's not with us. We're indwelt by him and we have him. And so we can endure. So even though we're not God, we can endure because God is in us. That's the biggest lessons we learn from Job. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you for this. I thank you for these lessons that we learn in Job. I thank you for I thank you for giving us the book of Job. There's a lot of things in Job that's hard to understand. There's a lot of things that we'll never understand. But Lord, I think we also need to come to the fact of concluding that sometimes when it comes to you, it's okay not to understand. Because our God is not a God that we can put in a box. You're so much bigger than that. You're so much bigger than our minds can fathom. And so, God, I just pray that you bless each and every one of us as we continue this reading plan. God, I pray that you would help us to follow you and to grow closer to you. In Christ's name I pray. Amen.